welcome to my channel, Haylee Marie Vintage. Today, of course, we are here in the sewing corner for a sewing project. I'm really excited about this one. This has been a very special project I have been saving. Let's talk about it. I'm first going to talk about the pattern. I have had this dress pattern for a bit, and I think it's incredibly stunning. This is 1950s. It's a pretty full skirt. I think they're pintucks. I also like the bolero in this one, or it's not that I like the bolero, it's that I have been convinced by a few things to give a bolero a try. I recently bought a dress with a bolero that I adored, and I thought it really made the set. So there's that reason, but also I finally met up with Serena in person. I'll link her down below. She has a YouTube channel, and the boleros look so good on her, and I'm like, why don't I make boleros more? That was kind of the other inspiration. Usually I would make this dress without the bolero, but assuming I have the fabric, I am going to make the bolero. For the fabric, and why I say assuming is I may not actually have enough fabric here to make the bolero, and if that happens, it happens. But this is the fabric I am using for this project. It's this beautiful kind of cornflower blue linen. This is just so my color. I love this color range. You see this color range a lot in my channel because it's the best. And also I think it looks really good on me, but you know, that's just a perk of it. I think I picked this up when I was in Portland once, and it's just this really beautiful, soft and flowy linen. It has a very good hand to it. So I think it'll work really well for this dress. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, Haylee, this is really plain and subdued for you. Don't you worry, I have plans. Yes, I clearly like a lot. I mean, look at my shirt. The extra special detail of this project is going to be this lace here. This is some Swedish vintage lace that I picked up at a place called Allyn's in Denver. It is really expensive. I can't remember if it's $25 or $35 a yard. This is pricey stuff, and I have been just saving it for exactly the right project. I think putting it with linen makes sense. I'm chasing the wisteria here because I think that this dress would look really good in a little wisteria photo shoot. So that is hopefully the plan here. And I adore the little daffodils with what these could be wisterias, they could be grapes. I don't care what they are. I love them. I'm excited to do a project with this. Are you looking? Do you want to say hi? Spooky says hello. She mainly says hello to me. She's been very, very clingy. I've been not traveling a lot lately, but I feel like I've been very busy lately, so I feel like she's very clingy right now. I love this lace so much that I bought them out of all of it. I'm going to hand sew this down. This is such special lace. I would not consider not hand sewing it. Oh my goodness, kiddo. Spooky. You can stay, but you guys stay on this side. Apparently, I have a little baby. What are we doing? I don't want you on that shoulder. You can be on this shoulder, or you can go back to the ground. Yeah, you can't cover my mic. Can't cover my mic, you silly goose. See, it's okay. This is comfy. You know, you convincing your cat that the choice that they made is comfortable, even though it is firmly not comfortable for you. So I definitely want this lace down around the hem. I'm thinking about whether I can put it up around the yoke. We're gonna have to kind of experiment and see. I don't totally know my whole game plan for this, and then of course I'm gonna want this to live somewhere on the bolero if I can make the bolero. So we're gonna see how all that goes. We have a lot to figure out. I'm gonna take you along for the journey of figuring it out, and I'm so excited about this project. This is a project that I've been definitely dreaming about. So, and with that, we are going to jump over into cutting out this fabric. Alright, I am cutting this out. Ignore some of that really ugly staining on this pattern. I don't know what happened to it, but it was before me. I will note this pattern was relatively crunchy and made me a little anxious to use, but it's fine. It all worked out. What you see me doing here is I am adding an extra 5/8 of an inch to the side seams to get this to fit me the way I would like it to. Just know that's why you see me doing some of this weird cutting. And then I've also shortened it by 2 inches, and so I do have to draw in a little bit of a line to keep that like smooth line through the skirt pieces. I've just generally found if I shorten it 2 inches, it saves me cutting off 2 inches from the bottom of the hem, disrupting my seams, and then also making the skirt slightly less full. And when I'm working on a project with a full skirt, I would like it to be as full as possible. But aside from all of these different notes, this is otherwise a pretty straightforward cutting. Other than, I guess my last note is I am putting an extra 5/8. I think I did 7/8 to give me just that extra bit of wiggle room in the back for where the zipper is going to close, just because I like to move my zips from a side zip to a back zip, because I find with a back zip I can make something that fits me much better and is also more accessible for me to get in and out. But yes, otherwise it is business as usual. And with business as usual, this is your reminder that I do have a Patreon that you can go over and support me for $5 a month, or $5.50 on Patreon because I take a little more fee than my Ko-fi, which is $5 a month. Here you just get access to videos early and some polls to help make some project decisions. I don't put any content or videos behind that are like not accessible for everybody, just because I understand that we are in an economic crisis and I don't want to take away content from people who it helps them find peace. And since this isn't my main source of income, I have the luxury of doing that. Also, please don't support me if you are financially struggling at all. I don't want your money if you're having a hard time getting by. But if you are in a good spot financially and feel the desire to support me, you can support me over there. I didn't cut every single piece of this on camera, but I do want to know I used every last yard of this fabric, which is pretty rare for me. I usually have some left over. Instead of cutting the bolero lining in that linen, which would have been my ideal, I used this random lavender cotton I happen to have in my stash. And I do think there's a little bit of polyester in this because I did pick it up at a thrift shop at some point, but I do try to pick up things for lining secondhand as much as possible because they don't matter as much as what's on the outside of the garment. It also helps me cut costs and results in things being a tiny bit cheaper. And then I also know on the bolero I'm giving myself that extra 5/8 inch in the waist, so I have that little bit of wiggle room. And the last thing I need is some interfacing. I will note most vintage patterns do not tell you exactly what might need interfacing. This one only mentions the button reinforcement interfacing, but I also like to have interfacing in the collar of the bolero, and then I'm also going to cut it for the top neckline of the dress. So that's what I'm doing here. Everyone kind of interfaces how they feel, and I like to have it up around the neckline so I can have really, really crisp necklines, as well as then following what's in the pattern and backing those buttonholes, which makes a ton of sense. It is the next morning and I had to delay the tiniest bit because I did not have any good matching thread. So I took a quick trip to my local Joann's, and now I am back at home. I don't usually require my thread to match as well as I required this thread to match, but because I am actually going to be doing some pin tucking, that thread will be on the outside of the dress, so it's really important to me that it blends and that it doesn't catch your eye. So here what you see is I am going to work on pinning those pleats in. There's kind of like a main flat faux button front pleat at the very middle, and then there are, I believe, 3 pin tucks along the sides. And I'm just prepping these for sewing by a whole lot of pressing, and what I've done is I have marked the dots on the wrong side of the fabric, and then I poke pins through them, kind of get them all aligned with the pins, iron that down, so that way I don't have to mark the outside of the fabric and worry about getting rid of those lines later, because the pattern will tell you like usually like a inch measurement for how you do the pleating. So if you can avoid marking on the outside, that is what I do, and that is what I'm doing here, and that's why what I'm doing here takes just a little bit longer, but it results in me not having to worry about as many pencil marks, so I think it's well worth it. And now it's time to sew these pin tucks. These pin tucks are actually really large. They are designed to be 3/4 of an inch, which is definitely the widest pin tuck I've done, and is why you see me sewing the way I'm sewing. It's a very bizarre feeling to sew a pin tuck this wide, but it's what they demand, so I will deliver. And with that done, I'm now going to iron all my pin tucks in place, including that front weird center faux placket thing. It was a little hard to get this centered and looking what I felt like was correct. I will say, I think if I was to do this project again with this linen was a tad flimsy for pin tucking, and I feel like it resulted in a little bit of unevenness, so I would have actually starched this before I did the pin tucking if I was to do this exact project again. So I guess learn from my mistakes. I did decide I really didn't like how the front placket ended up, and it was way too crooked, so I did unpick everything, remarked things, repinned things, and will resew things. Every once in a while it just pays to do fixes like this, especially since this will be front and center emphasized with buttons and all that jazz. So although I didn't really want to do it, I thought it would be worth my time. And after resewing this, I am much happier with my shape on this front placket, so yay! I will now be turning my focus to the side parts of this front piece, which requires just a couple, I guess, horizontal darts. In the bodice, which I'm marking here, these darts feel pretty deep, but it's just because of how much I lengthened that side seam. But after marking and pinning them, I will be sewing them up, pressing them, and getting ready for the next step. The next step is actually sewing those sides to the front pleated part. This was really interesting because I had to be super careful of the pintucks because the pintuck is ultimately going to cover this seam, so it looks fairly seamless at the front. So I had to really make sure my pieces were in order so I didn't accidentally sew through that pintuck, because you're essentially sewing the seam less than 1/4 of an inch away from where that pintuck is sewn, so it pays to go pretty slow and pretty careful. And for some reason something possessed me to finish these seams by doing some pinking, even though these seams will be covered by a lining and did not need to be finished, but I guess I was in a finishing mood. Here is that lining I was talking about. I think using a lining here is really interesting. It must just be a desire for a nice finish, because I don't think it's actually necessary for the construction of the garment. But I did prep the lining, and this is almost more of like a flat lining as opposed to the kind of like inside out lining. I don't know, bag lining? Question mark. Before I sewed that, I then realized I had forgotten to put in some darts on the lining. So I'm real quick putting in those darts, and then I will be making that lining sandwich again. It was also at this moment in time that I did the back darts. It was also some point here that I realized I didn't need to put on the lining yet, because it was going to be a key part of making up some of the rest of this garment. So we're holding for a second. Here I am pinning that back seam together, and I'll sew it up and press it in preparation for the eventual zipper that will go here. And it is here that I have now put on the back and front outside non-lining piece here, and I am pressing open those seams because eventually the way I will add in the lining for this will help with the armholes, which is what is happening here. I am pinning the lining in. I actually ended up cutting out some back lining pieces so that way I could just fully have the top of this lined and even in like its color density. And then I am pinning just the armholes here because the way you do the band at the front, don't want that stitched up, but I will have some really nice clean armholes. So that is what we're working on here. Once the armholes are sewn together, I am clipping those seams and getting them ready to press out. And with the armholes clipped, I am now understitching those armholes so that way when I press it, everything will roll nicely into the armholes and I won't have anything sticking out weird from the armholes. And then here I will be pinning up the side seams. So I'm basically doing one long line of the lining to the outside with the like understitching I just did in the middle. And then that will all flip together nicely to have a fully done bodice as far as like the armholes go, which is great because doing an armhole with a bias binding is not my fave. Hopefully here you understand what I'm talking about a little bit better as I am pressing this. You can kind of see that fully formed armhole, the way the lining and the bodice and all of that jazz kind of lines up. So with that done, I'm going to pin the bottom of this bodice half and the neckline part of this bodice to each other and baste it so that way they're stuck together for the next steps in this process. My first step here is to press on the interfacing to the neckline pieces. And then up at the shoulder, I will be sewing the band pieces together, so both the interfacing pieces together and then the non-interfaced pieces together, and this will make up kind of that top band interfacing part of this project. Usually I would just fold this nicely and press it and do all that jazz and not sew down the clean edge for the inside of this band, but I was feeling like skipping some hand sewing here because I know this is going to be a hand sew heavy project. So I actually went ahead and sewed this down with my machine for that clean edge finish I'll eventually end up with. I am now using all the different markings, notches, seams, and things to ease the bodice band with the rest of the bodice together. This just takes the tiniest bit of easing because you're technically doing sort of opposite circles. I'm just using a ton of pins and being careful with my pinning. And now for what feels like the millionth time in this project, I am snipping and clipping the inside of these seams. And this will help me get a beautiful neckline press, as seen here. And then I'm just going to pin the facing to the band that I just made. And I am again clipping into the fabric. I feel like this is one of the most heavy clipping projects I've done in a long time. There's just a lot of curvy seams here. And after clipping that, I am understitching the neckline to again get that really beautiful turn over in pressing line. And here I'm tackling the skirt with, again, my furry supervisor who seems to maybe be ready to sleep on the job. She has some alertness right now, but later she'll sleep instead of keeping a close eye on my sewing. But here what I'm sewing up is just your regular 6 gore skirt. So I am sewing 6 panels together, which is more than 6 seams, but I don't feel like doing that math right this second. I think it might technically be 7 seams when you seam 6 panels together. That's some math that I don't need to do. I do lots of math on this channel, so I guess Spooky was approving enough of my sewing that she moved off her sleeping perch and went somewhere else to live her life. Also, she's starting to rust. I was reading about black cats rusting, and I guess she's been getting too much sunbathing in. Well, I will persevere and sew without my furry assistant or supervisor. I don't know what she is. And for all those seams that I just sewed, I'm going to use pinking as my finishing. Arguably, I should probably use something like a zigzag here because linen is usually a little bit of a looser weave. I have factored a lot of ease into this dress because I want it to be comfortable, so I think I won't be putting enough pressure on the seams to make the pinking an issue. The next morning, I'm kicking it off with some hand sewing and TV. I am just slip stitching the neckline down. This is the finished edge I did on my machine because, again, I knew I would be doing so much hand sewing on this project. I needed to save my poor little handsies from too much stress. But now the stress begins. And I'm now returning to the skirt. I need to unpick the zipper here where it will eventually go. So here I am going to pin the top of the bodice, matching all of my notches, all of my seam points, all of that good stuff to make sure I have the correct fit of the bodice into the skirt. And this is one of those skirts that is like half bodice, half skirt because it is wider at your ribs, cinches in, and then flows back out. And I honestly usually skip pressing my waistbands, but here I'm making sure to give everything a good press up because of the way this is lined. Because the lining will cover those ugly, ugly, ugly seams. Why do we call seams ugly? That's something for me to ponder later. But I am pressing that over about a 1/2 inch and then I will pin it to the waist seam to get a beautifully lined bodice where you can't see all the seam work I just finished. And now it's time for me to pop in the zip. I probably should get better about basting these in first. I know it's such an easy step to take. But again, I gotta save my hands on this project because I'm going to have hours of hand sewing ahead of me. So I'm just kind of freewheeling and dealing the zipper in and it ended up pretty aligned. So I'm pretty happy with my result of just pinning it at a few key places. And now with trying it on, I get to prep the hem. So here I'm first creating a finished edge on my hem by just folding this over a 1/4 inch and sewing it down. And then from the top, my next step is to put a bunch of basting stitching, and this will help me ease in the fuller bottom part of the skirt when I actually press the hem, which you'll see in just a second what I'm talking about. I think I ended up needing to hem this 3 inches, but don't quote me on it. But the way this works is I use my gauge to put some like key pins in and gather up that hem edge that I just put in and ease that in so that way the end of my hem that you actually see from the outside is really, really even and pressed really nicely and has none of those weird tucks and wrinkles you can get from a curved hem like this, especially since this hem is pretty drastically curved. And I'm going to keep on stitching, and I went ahead and I put in my label by hand because I forgot to do it earlier. Usually I try to put these in by machine, and I'm also going to stitch up the hem at this point. Now it's time for trim placement, which is one of the most exciting parts of this dress. That is the only reason I feel like I work in solid colors, is because then it just really allows the trim to pop and shine. And that is really important because this trim is so special and it deserves every way to shine. So I'm just pinning this in. I am using the hem actually as my marking point, so I'm not needing to measure. I am going to basically cover, even though my slip stitches are pretty invisible, I'm going to then cover it with this trim. I think the bottom of this skirt is 3 yards around. I think it was about 3 yards of trim that I ended up pinning to this. Okay, I had pinned all the trim on and I tried it on before beginning the hand sewing process to make sure I like it, and it turns out I felt like it was too low on the hem, wasn't giving it its like proper spot to shine, so I am now repinning all of this trim again significantly further up, with the bottom being 6 inches above the hem because I just feel like it's a much better looking placement. You have to experiment with lace placement, and if you're going to put in the investment of hand sewing, make sure you really like where it's going before you sew it down, because while redoing this was not ideal, it is much better to redo it at this stage than after I've spent the hours hand sewing it on. And now I'm heading to the button bin to choose my buttons. I have decided to perfectly match the tone of the trim. I'm going to go with these white square buttons. These are definitely more modern than what I usually use, but most vintage buttons had just too much of that yellow tone in it, and the lace was really quite a bright white. I'm now turning my eye to the bolero, so I'm first doing all the inner facing prep, which is just the collar and to do backup on the buttons. Usually I do sew this to the facing pieces, but I decided to sew it to the linen pieces because the linen's just a little bit looser and I feel like could really use that extra structure attached to it. And my first step here is to mark, pin, and then sew the darts in the bolero, which there are 6. There's 2 on the back and then 2 on each front side. And as always, anything I do to the outer fabric, I'm going to do to the lining. Once that's done, I decided to press things up by 5/8 of an inch on the outside piece before sewing things together. This I just know will help when I put in the lining. You'll understand why I did this later, but it is not clear right now. And with the bodice, I am pressing it over 6/8. Again, this will become clear later. And now I will be pinning both the shoulder seams and the side seams of the lining and the outside fabric. I also need to get my collar ready, so after seaming the 2 pieces together, I'm then going to cut a bunch of notches, again, to make it a lot easier and cleaner of a press for this collar. Once it's clipped, I turn it inside out, and for the collar, I just want the very top of the lace, the kind of daffodil looking flowers. Spooky was incredibly invested in what I was doing for a second, so I'm cutting that apart. This was some more wear and tear on my hands that I arguably didn't need, but I am nothing if not an intense person when it comes to projects, no matter sometimes the suffering, which is not a fantastic quality I recommend. And now I have placed this lace on the bolero, and I am hand sewing the lace onto the bolero before I do the lining for a few reasons. One, then the stitching doesn't go all the way through to the lining, but also when I sandwich the lining piece with this piece, I want the lace to like nicely fit into that, which you'll see what I mean in a second, as opposed to laying on top of it. So that is why we are where we are. I am going to be hand sewing till the cows come home. Once that hand sewing was done, I remembered that I wanted to add my label, not by hand, because again, trying to save some hand sewing, so adding the label to the lining here on my machine. And now we're getting ready for a collar sandwich. I'm first going to pin on the collar and then baste it onto the outside exactly the way it should sit, hitting all of the notches and seams and all that good stuff. And with that done, we are now making our lining sandwich, where of course I have pinned some things, where I am pinning the lining along the neckline and the sides of the bolero. Once that is sewn, I am, again, you guessed it, cutting in all those notches. And once that is done, I will understitch it all. So that way, again, all my seams roll in nice and lay as nice and flat and as planned as possible. And here is where that folding I did earlier comes into play. It was way easier to do that when that was all separate pieces. And now that I have that almost like scored per se, I can then just flip that lining and that outside fabric, pin it to equal this really, really easy to sew hem situation. And while I'm here, I'm gonna pop in those buttonholes. This is pretty easy and straightforward. I am so glad I learned how to use my buttonhole foot. And I'm quickly stitching that hem down by making sure to not pick up any fabric on the outside and just stitching it to that little fold over I had made. While sewing, Spooky decided that she needed a hug, so I let her into my lap and gave her a hug, and I guess got to sew around her until all of a sudden she decided she wanted to exit after all that drama. It was very ridiculous, but I do love her, and she did settle down at the end. And now with the lace done for the bolero part, I have confirmed I have enough lace for the neckline, so I am cutting more lace. I'm not gonna lie, cutting apart this lace felt a little bit like a crime. From here on out, I'm going into days and days and days of hand sewing. This project took so much hand sewing. I was taking it everywhere with me. This is me at my pottery group. While everyone's doing pottery, I'm in the corner doing all this hand sewing. And here I am back home with Spooky, still hand sewing. Still moving along, I hand sewed every single evening because of course 24 hours is the amount of time in a day. So it took a long time. However, I felt like I had to hand sew this lace because it was really expensive, but also like I just couldn't think of a way to sew through it that would feel like it was respectful to the lace. That sounds so strange, but I feel like when you have materials as fine as this, you need to like treat them in kind of a certain way. But here what you do see is the last sewing around the hem. You can kind of see, if you look closely, where I have the ends of the lace kind of merging and matching. I did my best to get that to be nearly invisible. But yes, I am relieved to be towards the end of my 24 hours of hand sewing. And with the hem done, I am now to my truly last few hours of hand sewing, just adding the kind of daffodil-y portion to the top of the neckline. And now I'm finishing out by sewing on these buttons, and we are finally ready for that reveal. All right, you have seen the reveal. Like usual, we'll have our cost breakdown and all that good stuff. Other than the wisteria, I don't think we're getting a good wisteria bloomed this year, because I had planned to take photos with this with a wisteria, and I think the way it worked out is still really beautiful and lovely, and I like the irises and all that, but it was just very strange because we're moving already into rose season, and I feel like we never really got to enjoy peak wisteria. That's just a problem you get when you live somewhere that has so many different flowers blooming. But we will go into the cost breakdown now. This one I'm going pretty straightforward with. This is gonna be the usual rundown. So for the fabric, I spent $76 on the linen and $4 on the lining fabric I used, bringing us to a fabric total of $80. I guess warning, this one is very expensive. And the main reason it is very expensive is the lace I used was $32 a yard because I saw it a few years ago. I fell in love with it. I thought about it for a whole year before I went and I bought it, and now it's on the stress. I don't know, that's interesting, neat, weird, whatever you want to call it, but the total, because I used so much yardage of this lace, the lace was $196.44, and then the zipper, thread, all that jazz notion-wise was $8.54, bringing us to a notions total of $204.98, and then the pattern was only $14.32, and I will use this pattern again. I really like this pattern. That brought us to supply total of $299.30, which I believe makes this the most expensive project I have done this year so far. If we weren't talking about the trim, we would be right around $100, but of course we have the trim, and continuing to throw off the numbers of how long and how expensive it was for me to make this. Because I did so much hand sewing of the trim, we are up pretty high in our hours. This is also the longest project I think I've worked on this year so far. I took 2 hours and 45 minutes cutting. I don't know what took so long other than I just assume it was like the number of pieces and the fact I had linings and interfacing and a bunch of other stuff to deal with. And then as far as the sewing went, I was like on my machine and ironing for 7 hours and 45 minutes. And then for the hand sewing part, I hand sewed for 14 hours. Yeah, I don't know what to say. That brings us to a total time spent on this project of 24 hours and 30 minutes, which explains why I feel like this was the project that never ended. I just felt like I was constantly sewing this, felt like I was dragging it everywhere with me, sewing, and it's because I was. So we are going to talk about a living wage like usual. I do want to note, like, obviously this is not the same as in a factory setting. You would not hand stitch the trim I put on. You would actually probably use an embroidery stitch to mimic the lace that you're doing here. So when we talk about the pricing of this piece, I want you to think of this piece as being more couture and not as much of a everyday shop piece, if that makes sense. Even though I'm going to then compare it to everyday shop pieces, but all of those pieces would use an embroidery machine and would not do it the way I did it. When you're talking about the way I did it with the hand stitching on, we've moved into like a couture expensive house where you're talking thousands of dollars for a single dress, which that is out of reach for most people. Even though like my work is arguably most comparable to that in this case, I don't really actually want to compare my work to those houses because I fundamentally disagree with the way those houses run. But anyway, back to living wage. Here in Seattle, $35.39 is a living wage an hour. That's US dollars, $35.39. I feel like I said that really weird. That gets us to a labor total of $867.06. So if you were gonna, like, again, this is not comparable to a factory, but like if you were going to commission a seamstress to do this work or something like that, that is where it would end up. And that brings us to a grand total of $1,166.36. This is exactly why I tell people I won't sew for them. It's not because I'm selfish, it's because a lot of times they see pieces like this and think they're really cool and don't have a fundamental understanding of how much work is in it. Usually once I explain to people that like, oh, that takes me like 25 hours, they don't continue with their requests. But it is why I think it's really important to talk about hours, because I personally would never spend this money on a dress. The most expensive dress I've ever considered buying is around $600, and it's definitely not a linen dress. And then I did do my usual trying to find comparisons. This was really challenging for a couple of reasons. Again, first the trim and the way that is more couture, and I don't know how to shop couture, so I can't really give you that comparison. So like usual, I have an ultra fast fashion, a mid-tier fast fashion, and a slow fashion price comparison. So for the ultra fast fashion, I just was looking for something that was a dress with a blazer, or not a blazer, a bolero, or like a shrug of some sort, like a matching set. And most of what I could find was like 90s inspired, but I did find one piece that was a denim shrug with this really ugly denim skirt that somehow was all made out of polyester. I don't know how that works. It did not have embroidery. And again, this is not a one-to-one, that $35, because they're not even in the same realm of style, but I just couldn't find anything ultra fast fashion that was within the style of this dress. And then having the bolero. As for the mid-tier, I was able to find a set that I felt like was pretty comparable. The other thing is we just don't wear boleros with dresses the way they did in the 50s to get that like 2-for-1 outfit deal. But I found a mid-tier version that I would say this again had no embroidery, no trim, no extra shebang, and it was made of nylon, rayon, spandex. So mostly, I was gonna say fake. It's very real. Synthetic, mostly synthetic. And then the slow fashion version that I found a dress with embroidery details that I thought like matched the general silhouette and the number of pieces. I couldn't find like a dress and bolero set. So this again is not accurate. I found a slow fashion one for about $202. That was linen. So we have one comparison checked off. But yeah, this was a super weird one to do. And like I said, I don't know how to shop for the like couture because that's probably what I actually needed to compare this to, and I just don't know how to do that. But as always, disclaimer, this is just to make you think about what it would actually cost to pay people a living wage. Clothing is one of the very few things that has actually not like inflated over time. It's actually deflated, and there's a lot of reasons for that, such as like industry, manufacturing, but another big reason is the use of unethical and slave labor. So all things to think about when purchasing your clothing. Again, this is not to like point fingers at each other, but just to be more mindful about how we consume and how we contribute to the oppression of people in other countries. But enough of this part of the rant. We're going to talk about the project itself. I think I'm going to start with the dress. So this linen was kind of loose, so I do feel like the pintuck part is just not quite as neat as I would have liked. I think I should have used some starch or something and gotten it just a little bit crisper, but I still think it is, of course, really beautiful. And this dress is so comfortable to wear. I feel so pretty in it. I got a ton of compliments on it. Honestly, this is everything I dreamed of. So 10 out of 10 on this piece. Aside from this feeling looser here, I actually think otherwise I made this really well. It is nice to have that double linen lining that I wasn't so sure about when I started it. I think it's truly a stunning piece. This trim just like truly has my heart in a ridiculous way. I don't know what about this trim I love so much. There's just something about it that makes my heart sparkle. I don't know. As far as fit, you could say I could definitely nip this a little bit more in the waist and have it be a little tighter. That's just like not how I'm wearing clothes these days. I'm not wearing them to be the tightest possible. And with a linen dress, I feel like you want a linen dress to have enough movement to flounce in a field of flowers, you know? I don't feel like you want a linen dress to like suck you tight. I feel like that's what like a brocade is for, or at least that's my own kind of silly justification. I hadn't even thought about cutting apart the lace to do a trim like this until I was talking to the store owner, and she's like, yeah, you could cut it all apart and make a bunch of appliques. She was right. She's a genius. I loved it. I don't know. This project made me happy. Wearing this dress makes me happy. I'm super happy that this is in my wardrobe. And although Spooky just almost fell and took my light out with her. Hey, baby, are you okay? Oh, I know. It was so hard. Anyway, it was well worth hand stitching this on. And I did. I really, truly felt like this lace was so beautiful that I couldn't not take the time to hand stitch it on. I felt like this would absolutely be completely inappropriate to do with a machine in an ugly way. So here we are. The bolero is the next piece. This is super stinking cute, and I was just thinking like you could wear this with like you could wear this with any type of short, but I would love to wear this with a really high-waisted short. I think it would be really cute. I could put it on over a pair of overalls. I don't know. I think there's a lot of really cute uses for this outside of just the dress. And I think I didn't appreciate a bolero until I met up with Serena and saw her bolero and realized how much it takes a piece from like, I want to say day to night. It's much easier for me to not feel weird wearing a dress like this in the office with my arms showing if I do have the bolero. My office isn't that conservative. I mean, you can wear a tank top. It's just like definitely a tiny bit frowned upon. So it was nice to have the coverage of the bolero. And I do really like the two different looks I feel like this gives from the same dress with the bolero. I think this was well worthwhile. I also liked the fact that the bolero allowed me to get the detail to the top. And yeah, I think that's kind of it, but I'm just really happy with this project. I think I did a pretty fantastic job. I'm glad I waited as long as I did to use that trim. I did have to break into the secondary trim that I bought. I had gone and bought the last 2 yards. I bought 4 yards my first time buying it, and then I was like, you know what, when I make this project, I'm gonna definitely need those extra 2 yards. And those extra 2 yards is what ended up on the bolero, so without that, I wouldn't have been able to decorate the bolero, and that would have been a true shame. So I would have had a very plain bolero with a very over-the-top dress. Sometimes your instincts are right, even if your instincts cost you a lot of money. I enjoyed this project. I hope you enjoyed it too. If you did, definitely subscribe and stick around. I post a new sewing project every other week, and then I have additional vintage, crafty, whatever I want content. A lot of travel recently actually, outside of that. So if that interests you, yeah, I would love to see you here every single Friday. And then of course you can always support my channel by subscribing to my Patreon. I put so much time, as you just saw, effort, I guess, as you just saw, and money behind this channel. I don't even remotely break even. I am actually at negative 82 cents an hour for this channel. I'm losing 82 cents for every hour of work I put in this channel. So yeah, if you want to support me over on Patreon or Ko-fi, I super appreciate it. But with that, I am going to bid you adieu, and I will see you next Friday at 8 a.m. Pacific time. Bye!